We were just a bunch of nerdy kids who ignored the haters. We took their ridicule and we built on it. And when some of us gave up, well, we built on that too. Built resilience, built on a mission to make things a little better every day until the users came. Then the haters were VCs who scoffed at our audacity. This just isn't the way things are done. But we kept building. Users turned into teams, turned into companies, running their entire businesses on our apps. Then the software giants came after us. We weren't proven, we weren't fully featured, our radical cloud model wasn't secure. But we built on. And today, as companies adopt the cloud to move faster, teams are finding themselves slowed down by each other's efforts. The skeptics are claiming we'll never develop innovation at scale. But now, DevOps have come to the cloud, ushering in a new era of transformation. Companies can release on demand across hundreds of environments, innovating faster with fewer conflicts and fewer disruptions. There will always be challenges. There will always be naysayers. And we'll build on.
So hi everyone, welcome to Virtual Dreamin. I'm going to talk to you today about Salesforce DevOps and my personal top 10 tips. And really what I'm talking about is how to be truly agile with Salesforce. I'm going to try and not be too technical today, so apologies if I dive into a few buzzwords on the way. So yeah, my name's Richard Clark. I'm CTO at Provar Testing, the #1 test tool for Salesforce. I'll be in our booth in the expo after this session if you want to chat with me. You can reach me on LinkedIn and Twitter as well using richclark808 if you've got any questions. Now, the reason for giving this talk is if you go onto Trailhead and you look up DevOps, you probably would find a course on application lifecycle management. And it's actually quite a good course, very detailed, lots of options, great information, and some practical examples to follow. However, that isn't DevOps. So there's a gap around that doesn't plug. So it's a lovely picture. Not all the boxes are ticked unless you know the products that are available in the App Exchange. And so a more traditional view of DevOps and the bringing together of development and operations is the infinity loop in the bottom right corner. And what you can see from that is missing from this diagram really are things like monitoring and operate. And what does planning really mean? Are we just talking about writing user stories? No, there's far more to it than that. So I'm going to address some of those gaps today, but I'll also touch on some of these areas. So I'll be talking about source control. So I'll be talking about what is source that you want to track and why do you need to track it. I'll be talking about unit testing, and I won't just be talking about Apex unit testing. I'll be talking about the different types of unit testing, including for declarative changes. In a similar vein, when we talk about static code analysis, codes accentuated there because code doesn't just mean Apex, it doesn't mean JavaScript, it also means things like declarative changes. And that brings us nicely in terms of things about the environments that you use as part of your strategy, as part of your DevOps strategy. What are the environments you're going to use and the different org and source-based ways of doing it, which tells really nicely into release management and the whole process of release management and why we're doing it, and some of the tools that are available, both Salesforce specialized and more generic tools. My favorite subject, of course, is quality assurance. It's what we do at Provar. It's the tool that we provide. I'll try not to talk disproportionately about QA, but I will be talking about that as well, and types of testing and how that fits in the whole DevOps lifecycle. And then there's two subjects I'm very passionate about that often get mixed up: continuous integration and continuous delivery. I hope by the end of this talk today, you'll understand the difference between them and how you need to participate in each of them differently. The tools that are used are generally the same, but the processes are completely different. And then you may find it strange that planning's at the end. This is DevOps. We're talking about infinity. We're talking about iterative process. So at the end of one delivery, you should already be planning your next one. So I've deliberately put that at the end rather than at the beginning. The other key element is we've got a continuous cycle of delivery. We've got a continuous cycle of monitoring the operations of the systems that we're using. So I'm going to be talking and touching on some of those areas as well. I probably could have spent about 4 hours talking about this, so I'm going to try and talk as succinctly as possible today. Okay, so source control. I think you all understand what source control is in terms of things like, you may have heard of like Git, and Subversion and other systems to track source code. But when I talk about source control, I mean talking about all the deployable artifacts in an org that you have. So sure, you've got your code, but you've also got your code, your config. You've got metadata describing the objects and fields that you're using, the validation rules, page layouts, flexi pages. That configuration is a deployable artifact that you typically include. You want to be tracking that. You'll have data that you use. That could be static data, reference data that you use. It may be a zip code table. You may be using custom metadata or custom settings to hold some of that data as well. So you want to track that information as well. Ultimately, anything you want to provision into a sandbox or into a Scratch org, you want to be including your source control system. Not only that, when it comes to releases, you may have scripts that are part of that, or you may have documents like a playbook that you need to execute at the end of a deployment as well. Those things should all be going into your source control system, so you have a complete view. Now, I don't mind which source control system you use. Horses for courses. Most people tend to be using a Git-based one these days, but the important factor is that it's repository-based. And whether you host that repository within your own network or your private cloud, or use a public cloud service and restrict access, something like GitHub, that's down to you and down to your development practices. The important part for me around that is that you're using it to track that history of changes, that you understand how to use it, when to create branches, when to do pull requests, what a commit is, what a fork means, difference between a fork and a branch, quite important, but actually not well understood. And important that it's linked to your ticketing system. So I'm not going to talk about ticketing. I'm not going to talk about Jira today. I'm not going to talk about case management, because those are things most people using Salesforce already understand quite well. The important aspect is by integrating that with your version control, you can have a full audit trail between the changes that are made and the reason why you changed it in the first place, either to fix a bug or to deliver some new functionality. And then we have a choice to make. Depending on whether you're org-based or source-based, there'll be a slight change to how you manage your source control. Now, this term tends to confuse some people, so let me give you one simple question. If you were to lose the sandbox you're working on, or the Scratch org you're working on, and you would lose changes, you're doing org-based development. If that org or sandbox disappeared and you could recreate it with a click of a few buttons, you're source-based. So that's a very clear distinction. Now, what's really important is you should only choose one of those strategies per project. And that can depend on whether the resources of that project are mainly doing declarative work or mainly doing coded work. So it can change by project phase to project phase, but only use one strategy for that entire project is my advice. If your admins are doing org-based and your developers doing source-based, you're going to come against a conflict where the developers have used the wrong fields from the wrong object, or their unit tests were working for them, works on my machine, works on my org, but doesn't work when you put it into system integration test. So only use one of those strategies. So make those guidelines really clear and invest in staff training so people understand what's required of them and how they're going to promote changes. It's also important to use the right tool for the job, but also recognize that the VS Code may be great for a developer. It may not be the right tool for your admins in terms of interacting with your source control. So think about other tools, source tree, or other things more visual that are easier for your admins to use or your functional consultants to use to manage their changes. So now I want to talk about unit testing, and the important aspects of unit testing is to make sure you're verifying in your unit test that you've met the acceptance criteria of the story you're delivering or of the bug that you're fixing. The other aspect that's really important is that it's repeatable. So again, just because it worked once, it doesn't mean it works, okay? If it works in your sandbox, it has to work on the integration test sandbox or the production environment or any other environment as well. It shouldn't be dependent on data in that org, for example. Now, most people are familiar with Apex unit tests and the requirement for code coverage, an average of 75% minimum in production. Another aspect that some people on projects that I've looked at don't always do is they don't add a cert statement to the Apex unit tests. Now, if you ever try and publish an app on the App Exchange, I've done about 7, you'll find out very quickly that your request will be rejected on security review if you don't have cert statements in your Apex unit tests. And if you just try and get away with a cert true, that doesn't work either. You have to have meaningful cert statements. We're going to talk more about source code analysis very soon. I also recommend those unit tests are atomic. So what I mean by that is you shouldn't have one unit test for Apex that tests a whole class, start to finish, and relies on this trigger or that process builder or that workflow firing for its results. You should have test methods for each of your methods in your class, and you can still have your end-to-end unit test if you want as well. But the point is you have that coverage from both aspects. When it comes to Lightning components, in my experience, unfortunately, the Aura components I've seen in production orgs from customers and on my own projects, they haven't used the Lightning testing service. People haven't gone down the path of learning Jasmine and Mocha. It's probably too hard. Learning Aura in itself was difficult enough. If you're now embarking as a result of virtual Dreamin on things like Lightning Web Components, then I really recommend, as you adopt learning to write Lightning Web Components, because they're so much easier to write than Aura, do learn Jest at the same time. The payback you will get from that is infinite. You will learn so much and your quality of releases will improve so much as a result. Now for our Salesforce admins and functional consultants, every project I've worked on, those guys have done a huge amount of manual testing of their changes, whether they've changed a workflow rule or a flow or added a validation rule. Those people generally are far more attention to detail at testing those things. However, those tests aren't repeatable, they're manual, and they aren't always doing the end-to-end testing or business scenario testing. So just because a validation field worked on the new account page, does it also work on edit? Does it work when we've loaded some data up through an API, for example? So you need to be thinking of your declarative tests of whether you can automate the unit testing of those using tools such as Provar. Also on declarative testing, you still need some manual testing in terms of the user interface. You don't want to be passing things into your QA team that don't look right. So if you have 20 fields on one side of a page layout and 2 on the other, you can see that's not a good user interface. So you should try and adjust those and make things clear to people before you pass unit testing. Equally, user experience. If your tab order on a page layout is different, sometimes it's going down, sometimes going across, think about that user experience. If all your mandatory fields are scattered throughout the page, then it's going to be very hard for someone to use that screen, and they're not going to use that function. You can leave that to the QA to user experience if you prefer, but in my experience, admin people have more knowledge. So I said we're going to talk about static code analysis, and again, code includes Apex, Visualforce, HTML, CSS for your community maybe, JavaScript, and declarative again. So declarative has metadata that you can download that systems can interact with and pull. Now, you don't have to pay for a tool. The Salesforce Optimizer is an excellent feature in the setup menu. If you haven't used it, then please use it straight away. In terms of how often you use it, I recommend you use it at least as often as Salesforce provide their releases, and we've got Summer 20 coming up soon, so I definitely recommend you run it in your sandbox after it upgrades to Summer 20. I also recommend you use it whenever you deploy changes into a sandbox or you make changes to understand if you've made any errors in your declarative setup or in the code that you've deployed. But underpinning that, we also need to have coding and config standards. Many projects I've worked on have taken coding standards maybe from their Java team or their .NET team and adapted them for Apex. Most Apex developers have learned about bulkification of code, and generally those standards are well written. Unfortunately, many projects I've been on don't have any configuration standards. So are we using camel case for field names? Are we using underscores? When I write a process builder process, am I creating a new process every time, or am I trying to adapt a master process, and how does that work? So if you don't have configuration standards, you're going to run into problems with limits just as you would if you didn't have coding standards. So make sure you've got those documented. Now, the benefit of that is level 2 is we can use tools, some free, some paid ones. So I've used things like Clayton before, which allows me to configure what my local rules are, my house coding and config standards, and apply that in terms of measuring the quality of what I'm delivering. CodeScan, SonarQube, also out there, also can test Salesforce as well. Equally, if you've already invested in tools such as Copado or Gearset or any of the other release management tools I'm going to talk about today, some of those have a capability for doing source code analysis built into them. So it's worth considering using those to interact and to do the source code analysis. And then finally, if you've ever submitted an app to the App Exchange, you'll have done a checkmark scan. Checkmarks can be used for free. And when you use checkmarks, it will scan the org you provide and give you a report back. And it will look for security errors, cross-site scripting. It will also look for those assert statements I said about earlier. You can actually use that within any org. It doesn't have to be a developer edition org or an ISV package. However, just a caution, for very large orgs or quite large orgs, you'll find it will return unable to process and ask you to buy the product instead. So the tools above have an advantage over checkmarks for that. Finally, if your application is like any Salesforce org I've worked on, you probably have integrated some external systems. And there are a whole host of external app security tools that can look at those applications, be it a third-party portal or e-commerce solution that you've integrated with your Salesforce, and you want to check that end to end, or web services you're providing into Heroku or other services. So any of the tools there can be used as well, and there's plenty more as well. But think if that's necessary for your use case, for your DevOps. So that brings us nicely onto environment management. I've got two diagrams here. The one at the top is more of a source-based approach. So what we've got here is I've got one or multiple dev sandboxes. I've got a staging, UAT, and prod environment. In the bottom diagram, I've still got my staging, UAT, and prod environments. I happen to have an extra one called QA. You could ignore that for the sake of this. But ultimately, you describe what are the environments that I need in order to follow my deployment lifecycle. What do I need to clear? Who needs to sign off? Who needs to own those orgs? So who owns staging? Who owns UAT? And when can I make changes to those orgs? So really important you understand you don't make a change during the middle of a UAT window unless it's been planned and agreed in advance. Regardless of doing regardless of doing source or org-based environments, you need to think about your emergency changes that you need to make. So in the top one, we're using a Git repo there for holding a copy of version history, but we're still, as I said earlier, we're org-based because we start from a sandbox. But I still have a need to push things into production. So think about that as well. Equal in the bottom, I've got my developers and my admins following a standard process, putting changes through source control, putting it through my release management pipeline. You could say that's a perfect or a dream DevOps scenario. You have these sandboxes in terms of which sandboxes you should use for what. I've got a link at the end of the session for a great blog post around the use of full, config, etc. Different types of sandboxes for different use cases. So I do recommend looking at that. But think about your sandbox refresh plan. We're 2 weeks away from summer 20. You should already know which of these environments you want to stay on spring and which of these you want to be on summer. And that shouldn't really change. If you've ever been in a scenario like I have of being 2 a.m. in the morning and you realize your deployment's failing because it's source-based and the source org you took it from is on a later version than your production, you'll understand totally what I'm saying about there. Lastly, I'd also like to point out that probably one of the worst misnomers Salesforce have made since it was called Salesforce, when it does so much more, is DevHub. The DevHub is a mechanism for you to link all your orgs that you use day to day together. And you can have multiple DevHubs linked together as well. It's not just for developers. And I really encourage, if you're an admin or a solution architect, functional consultant, DevHub is a great way to track all your environments with aliases and never remember or write down a username and password again. So a real tip there for you. Look at DevHub if you haven't already on Trailhead. That segues nicely into release management. So Salesforce provide us ways to do release management through a set of free tools. So things like change sets, before that, and still we have the metadata API. And more recently, we've had the Salesforce CLI. Salesforce CLI has been also known as Salesforce DX, is a great way to both provide things like Scratch orgs, but also to move changes between sandboxes and Scratch orgs. And not everyone realizes that. We've also got advantages with things like packaging as well and versioning our releases. There are also a whole bunch of third-party tools. So at the top of the page, sponsors today, such as Copado, a very rich tool that can help you with your release management and track things automatically for you. And they may have a very good use case for your needs. But there are other free and paid tools, more generic continuous integration and continuous delivery tools such as Jenkins and GitLab and Bitbucket, etc., that you can use for your release management. What tool you need to use is down to your requirements. So I recommend you undertake a vendor comparison or a proof of concept of the tool of choice that fits your needs. Align it to your environment strategy. So don't just see a demo out the box, but be clear on what is your environment and release strategy and how does this tool meet and deliver that. What you don't want to do is change your process to meet the tool. So very important on that one. So if you're still awake, I can't see you guys, but you can see me. I'm hoping you're not all in a zombie-like state. We're halfway there, you'll be pleased to hear. There is a treasure hunt prize code at the end after Q&A. Okay, my favorite subject is always quality assurance. And quality assurance in this sense, I'm mainly focused on the testing side of things. There's lots of anecdotal and documented evidence that the earlier you test in your life cycle, the quicker and cheaper it is to fix the issues found. We've all been in those scenarios where something gets into production, and if you have a bug that reaches your production environment, your whole team will probably have to go through a whole cycle of change and test and release to fix it. If you can find that bug during the sprint or just after it's been developed by something like continuous integration, you're going to have hardly any cost at all to fix that issue before it goes forward. So do think about that. Bring quality assurance in throughout your process. It shouldn't be something left to the end that gets squeezed as you run out of time as you try and hit a deadline. Also really important to use tests that you can reuse. So you may have a test that does a certain feature and you can bundle those together into a test plan to test multiple things and to use for different purposes. So the same test may be used for your continuous integration to check when something's committed to your source code. The same test could be used for your regression to make sure it's still working after a deployment. And potentially the same test could be reused for a smoke test as well. Be really clear on your test strategy, what you're going to test and when. So are you testing just the changes made, or are you doing a complete regression test at each stage of your life cycle? When it comes to regression testing, it's often overlooked. When you're planning a project, we all focus on the user stories and we think of the cost and the story points for those stories to develop and deliver them, but we don't always think about the regression impact. So it's really important you think about that, and that when you allow time for a project that you're thinking about that I need to actually undertake regression testing of everything else. If you have used a tool such as Provar, you'll have a regression pack already, so you can save money doing that. And you can execute it on a sprint or on a release basis as you see fit, or daily if you wish. When it comes to user acceptance testing, then, if you can go into that with a pack of evidence saying, this is what we tested already, that you asked for, and we met these criteria, this is what we had previously delivered and it's still working, then your stakeholders will find UAT far more engaging than thinking that they have to test the whole system and spending hours and hours and hours, or not having time to do it because they've got to do their day job as well. So if you can get that level of engagement with UAT, you'll get a far better result out to your stakeholders. Ultimately, they can then tell you all the gaps that they forgot to tell you about, which will still happen, all the requirements they forgot to tell you when you agreed to user stories. When it comes to deployment, we want to smoke test. Does it still work after I deploy it? So we don't want to do a full regression test in production, but there are certain things, certain key business processes you want to validate are still working. So that could be your lead to cash process, it could be your ticket to resolve, or what is the key areas that you're using, your e-commerce site, etc., that has a value. And there's a place for automation tests. There's still a place for manual tests, even when you have automation. You're not going to automate everything. You still want to be looking at the user experience. You still want to be doing exploratory testing to understand other ways we can improve this. So you want to be more subjective, as well as having all the more dull, repetitive stuff automated. So continuous integration, I say hard to do well, easy to do badly. A lot of people think they understand continuous integration, and they think it means running a Jenkins server and running some unit tests every time someone makes a pull request. That's part of it. What you have to remember with continuous integration is it's a process, not a technology. We can use tools to automate certain parts of it, but your development team and your admins need to understand to make small changes repeatedly. They need to understand to commit those back. If continuous integration is going to be successful, you do not want a branch running for weeks on end, and then you get a merge conflict when it comes back. So it's very important for continuous integration that we have the ability people make changes, they merge them rapidly. Daily would be ideal, but very hard to do quite often. And that gets tested, the right amount of testing happens automatically. Really important that when that test happens, that the feedback goes to the right people or the right team, and they understand it's their job to fix that problem. So we want to make people accountable for breaking the build as such, but we also have to recognize that we're a team. And if an admin adds a validation rule that breaks an Apex unit test, you can't expect the admin to fix that unit test. But what you can do as a team is focus on that, and the developer and the admin can talk and understand, does the unit test have to change, or was the validation rule ill-conceived and needs to be consider some extra factors to it. It's not a question of one or the other, it's a question of one or the other maybe, but it's not a straight answer of which is wrong. So continuous delivery is often confused with continuous integration. Really at the heart of DevOps, continuous delivery describes the whole thing at the center. So it's those environments we talked about, it's the release management, it's the processes as well. So yes, we want to automate deployment across our environments. We want to know when we're going gated between each environment, but we also have to decide up front, what is our rollback strategy? So what are we going to do if this fails test when we deploy it? Are we going to fix it and move forward? Or are we going to be able to roll back and put a previous version in? And how do we decide to do that? So very important you document that rollback strategy. In terms of what you're deploying, so you want to deliver the configuration, the code changes, but you may also have some setup automation scripts. There are certain things that can't be deployed in metadata, so you need to decide, are you going to do that via a runbook, or are you going to use a tool to automate those extra setup steps or populate that data that's needed? One way of managing all of this with Salesforce DX is the unlocked and managed packages. You may have previously looked at managed packages in the past. With Salesforce DX and second generation packaging, there's a very rich and very useful mechanism for building and breaking an end customer org down into multiple packages or one package as you see fit. Multiple is better, and having versions between them. And that actually gives you a rollback strategy, something we never had on the old packaging. So if you haven't looked at Salesforce DX packaging, please have a look at that. Ultimately though, what we want is proof. So when we've deployed something to an environment, we want proof that it worked. We want proof that the deployment was successful. And so when someone says this isn't working anymore, we can check, was it working when we deployed it? Or did we not test that aspect? So very important you look at that. As I said at the start, planning, very important. It's at number 9 because we're iterative. So I like this deal, but I use this deal book quite a lot in presentations. People have often said to me, how are you delivering this? Are you using Agile? So how much is that going to save me? It's not going to save you any money. It's not going to deliver your end state any quicker than waterfall. What it's going to do is deliver iterative changes faster. You'll have something in your hands faster than if you went through a waterfall lifecycle. That's what Agile means. Agile quite often costs more. It costs more because people can change their minds. They're not stuck with a solution that's 2 years out of date. That's why more people are doing Agile. So really important with planning, it's about preparing for that next iteration. So we want to go through the backlog of stories that have been defined that maybe didn't make the last release. And we want to look at the new stories that were raised, but maybe not in scope or not prioritized for delivery within the last release. So we want to refine that backlog and groom it. It's also really important you don't miss out on retrospectives. So if you're following any sort of Agile or Scrum process, you should be following a sprint and release retrospective. You should be getting involvement from everyone involved and listening to everyone. The actions that come out of those retrospectives to improve the process or what went well that you could maybe share with other people, it's very important you share the good things and you try and fix the bad ones where you can. And if you're going to follow a methodology, if you're going to change or introduce a new methodology, if you're going to go Scrum, Scrumban, Kanban, or anything else, involve the whole team, ask the QA team, the dev team, the admins, the business stakeholders, make sure they understand what you're trying to do and what their role is in doing it. And very important that if you are adopting a new process or changing the process, don't use a whole new project or a whole new release to prototype it. Educate people what it is, dry run it with a few very minor changes so everyone understands what's involved and you can sort out any difficulties first. Last point I've got, I did say I need 10 points, is around ops and monitoring. So I talked about this at the start. So when ops and monitoring, the operations of Salesforce is largely handled for you by Salesforce. They provide the infrastructure for you, and they have the status website, and they patch it and update it on a weekly basis. And they, 3 times a year, you got a whole new Salesforce. It's fantastic. Brilliant. However, you have your own changes you want to monitor that people can change. Unfortunately, admins and other users can change environments. They can change a production environment, add a validation rule, and break everything. So you need to make sure you've got some governance. Most projects have some kind of center of excellence where they're looking at change requests coming in, or they have some type of change board. Don't forget to have some kind of technical or enterprise architecture review of those changes as well. Very easy to break things like GDPR with an ill-advised change that exposes data on a community, for example, if you don't know what you're doing. So do include your architecture team in those reviews at the right time. What's really important is to make sure that governance process remains lightweight and fast. To be DevOps, to have DevOps, to be agile, you want to be doing things repeatedly, quickly. So you don't want to have a 2 or 3 or 6 week process to do a governance review. But you do want gates at the right time with the right people involved. Ultimately, this depends on your business focus. So what's the value of the changes you're trying to deliver to the business? How much more value is it going to create for you in terms of reputation or dollar value? What is the cost of doing the change? So is it going to pay for itself? What's the time frame it's going to pay back? What's the impact of doing the change? Maybe it's going to make you the #1 in your industry. Maybe it's going to allow you to catch up with your competitors. And what is the risk you're going to take by doing this change? So could we upset our current customers? If we don't do it, what is the risk to the business? What's the risk to our reputation? So all these are factors that will affect your governance. On a more technical level, we can use solutions. So some of those release management tools I mentioned earlier, the Salesforce specialists will do metadata monitoring. So they will monitor you, hook them up to the org, and they'll tell you when someone's logged in to your production org and made that change to a validation rule, and you can decide what to do about it. If they're very good, they'll also tell you what the change was and ask you if you want to roll it back like that. So fantastic. You can also use your regression and smoke tests to monitor an org as well. So you can do that end-to-end business scenario testing. So you can check that my lead to cash or my ticket to resolve is all working as expected with a limited amount of data. Ultimately, though, you also want to look at the data in your org. So you want to use some analytics around it. So if I look at a pick list field, and that pick list field has an other value, how many times do you find your users always select other? How many fields which are required have a dots in or a dash? So you need to do some analysis and monitoring on the data in your Salesforce org. And if people are not filling things in as expected, you need to identify what the changes we need to make. So many orgs I've looked at, they'll have several hundred fields on, say, the opportunity or the case object, and yet a bare fraction are actually used. So why are they there in the first place? Are they duplicates? Are they being used? That's a continual process, not something you should be doing every 3 years. Ultimately, you want that evidence. If you can prove to someone when something was last working, and we've all been in a situation where you deploy something and something completely unrelated breaks, but everyone thinks it's your fault. If you have evidence when it was last working and you can prove that to someone, you can avoid a lot of time wasted investigating problems that are unrelated. That will really help out your Salesforce admins and your operations teams. So just a few quick fun questions. You don't have to reply. There's no Kahoot for this. You don't have to answer the questions in the chat window, which I see there's quite a lot, which is could take some time. So out of my talk today, which of the following was not one of my top 10 tips? Was it storing reference data outside of your version control? Ensuring you have a rollback strategy before you deploy? Using the static analysis tools on declarative as well as code? Or testing changes in your methodology on a small change first? I'm hoping you all realize the answer was A. You don't want to store reference data outside your version control. Keep all the artifacts together. This question's a lot easier, so I'm hoping 100% of people know the answer to this one. What should you do when your project's delivered late? Blame it on the developers. We've all been there. Blame it on the architects. I've been there. Blame it on the customer. I've been there as well. No. It's important we have a no blame retrospective or drains up. And we want to identify those actions and implement to avoid a repeat in future. We need to learn from our mistakes because it's iterative. That could be a training plan for someone. It could be a whole team having a changing process. Last question, very loaded indeed. When should you consider using test automation tools like Provar? Because your business has compliance, needs test evidence at various stages, because you're making lots of changes or regular changes to your Salesforce implementation, because you want to reduce the time to release changes, QAs may be a blocker for deploying changes into production or into UAT, or for all of the above reasons. Well, that's a trick question. They're all good reasons to use a tool like Provar, but I would say D is the best answer. If you've got all those three, you should definitely speak to us. Lastly, I just want to wrap up by saying there was a recent ZNet article published by Vala Afshar, the Chief Digital Manager at Salesforce. You need to sort of scroll halfway down, look for a diagram like this, where he talks about the more complete view of DevOps, in my opinion. So he's talking about the analysis, the build, the deliver, the operate areas. So it's a much better view than the one I deliberately had at the start. I happen to have marked this one up with Provar symbols of where Provar can best be used and the areas that you integrate testing within your whole life cycle. If you want to know more about the application lifecycle, I've got a link here if you take a screenshot. And this is to the trail mix that includes the packaging and the application lifecycle material and trailhead. It's definitely worth doing, but it is incomplete. Also a link to Salesforce Way. There's a blog article on the Salesforce refresh best practices for environments. So really good in terms of telling you what types of sandbox to use for what purpose. Again, very useful link. Lastly, if you're interested in talking to us at Provar, we've got a booth in the expo. Please come drop by. I'll be on there for the next 40 minutes or so, but I have colleagues through there throughout the day and into tomorrow as well if you want to talk and learn more about Provar. So before I continue, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do have some questions, and let's actually take them up one by one and see if we can throw some light on some of them. Some of the questions before that, some of the questions might be very specific to Provar. So for that, I'll request the participants to actually go to the booth where you can get it answered. And some of them are more general questions. So we'd like to, to spend this time on that.
That makes sense.
The first question is, what is the best source control tool for Salesforce?
So I think most people are using Git. So I would say Git, and the reason I say it is because it's the most popular and most people know how to use it. At the same time, if you're a very admin project, that may not be right for you. And that's why there's a choice in tools. So if you're very declarative, Git is horrible for an admin to learn. The difference between a push and a pull, the difference between a fork and a branch, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to someone that's not been living that for several years as a developer. So it does depend. So there isn't a clear answer. But if you go down the Git route, no one's going to fire you. Let's put it that way.
All right. So the other question that I have is, what do you mean by atomic test methods? So this was basically some references to your slides.
Yeah. So it's a talk in itself, isn't it? There's a very good talk from Rob Bailey on the London Developer User Group, which I'm a co-leader of. And he talks about a year ago, he talks about the different types of unit testing. It's a fantastic, about an hour-long talk, but it's absolutely incredible. But what I'm saying there in summary is if you have an Apex class, and you have, say, 6 methods in that, those that are publicly visible or those that you say test visible, you should have in your test class, you should have a test method for those so that regardless of whether they're executed or not, you have coverage. So it may be some of those methods are redundant, or maybe you've been writing methods that are never actually called in the business process. So normally if you worked based on inserting a record and an Apex trigger firing and the end-to-end flow, you'd never get any coverage on that method. So what I'm saying is write your test methods at the same level as your methods in your class, but also write something maybe more comprehensive about the process that may include, for example, a process builder or flow as well.
Awesome. Yeah. So one of the questions they have is, what is the best responsibility for DevOps? What should such person be most focused on? DevOps is a wide terminology, and such person can be part of almost every aspect of release management, right? So they really want to understand the role of, someone who is helping set up DevOps, managing DevOps.
That's a great question. So we rarely seem to come across people that are real DevOps architects. So if you went and did a job search on DevOps architecture, you'll find people with skills in things like Puppeteer. When it comes to Salesforce, that's not going to help you very much. So what it is, DevOps is a responsibility that everyone should have. So if you're going to have someone owning DevOps, their role should be to educate people and to make sure the things we've talked about on that wider map towards the end. So to make sure those things are covered. So if we're not doing backups and we don't have a restore plan, DevOps should be participating in making sure people are aware of the impact of that, especially when it comes to something like Salesforce, especially since Salesforce took away their £1 million service where you could request a restore. So if you haven't got a solution, definitely get one in place. So that would be my coaching there. It's a responsibility to educate people, to make sure things are being improved, and to be maybe external to the development team. So you're not embedded in the delivery and you're making sure that the process is working. So Scrum Masters potentially make very good DevOps people.
Awesome. Yeah, so there is one more question, and I think this is one of my favorite questions as well. So when would you do a manual package release to production versus having it deployed through your CI pipeline? Or can you really deploy everything through a CI pipeline? Are there any risks,
Well, that's a great question. There are things you want to still do in production. So best practice is not to give all your developers and admins access to production if you can. But many of us come from a situation where their org's grown up and all they had was production. They've always done it that way. And it may be what they're doing is writing reports and dashboards in production. Is that metadata or is that data? It's use of the system. And generally those things are okay to do in production unless you have a dashboard that the whole business is running off that you need to test. So it will depend on that. Equally, there are things that you might want to change, maybe the label of a field or an email template. So those things you can generally change if it's a small change that has very limited impact and you're aware of that impact, or it's an emergency hot fix, you can definitely push those by something like a change set. What the key there, though, is to make sure that you don't wait to replicate that into your process, that you go back and you make the real change and you commit it so it's not overwritten later. That's the key part.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would like to add onto that. A lot of times what happens in Salesforce is a lot of us are admins, who do not understand the metadata concepts very well. And a lot of times what we have seen is they go and make these quick changes, for example, writing a validation rule. Now, writing a validation rule might seem like a very easy task, right? But it might have a lot of impacts. For example, you might broke certain test classes because, those classes actually were not written, with the assumption that there will be a validation rule like this. So I think it's okay to add things into the production, but as you said, you have to go and communicate back that to, your DevOps manager or release manager, or, you have to commit back that whole thing that you just did in production and run your whole pipeline again to make sure you have not broken anything,
Exactly. And the other key point of that is your emergency change pipeline wouldn't be the same as your release pipeline. So you wouldn't have the same checks and balances. You still want to go through that process, especially in that example. But remember, DevOps, ideally, people are making thousands of changes a day. So people like Google and Amazon are changing their website multiple times per day. If you think about Salesforce, doing it 3 times a year is quite a slow change process. People don't realize they're changing it twice a week. And if businesses are going to become more agile and more DevOps, you need to be able to change your Salesforce implementation twice a week too, at least, or daily. That would be a successful DevOps process.
Right. So another question I have, and this is a very general question, and feel free to add your personal opinion as well on this. So the question is, what is the split between writing code and writing test? Out of experience, is it a 20%/80% split or a 50-50 split? 20 split, how can we write tests more efficiently?
So when it comes to Apex, unfortunately, personally, I find my unit tests always take longer than the actual code. I write some amazing code and then I come to write the unit test and I find that I forgot lots of things, or I then have to change what I've written in order to test it, especially if you're doing things like HTTP callouts and asynchronous methods and mocks and things. So I think it's definitely more. It's more than 50%, I think, on Apex tests. Now, if you do those changes declaratively, you're then faced with an even bigger problem. So it's really quick for me to set something up. and the manual testing is hard, and that's why things like Provar exist. It makes that catch up and gives you the same declarative ability to test something as to build it. But yeah, ultimately things like Apex definitely takes longer. Even things like Lightning Web Components, until you get used to Jest, it's quick, but it's probably a big learning curve for most Salesforce developers to learn something like Jest.
Right. And I recommend, initially to begin with, because I am myself writing a lot of Jest these days. What I recommend is for beginners, it's okay to actually go to the Jest website and just try out, without any Salesforce stuff in it. Just write a function, or maybe do some simple things, like, for example, write a class, or a TypeScript class, and just try to write a test case for that. And from there you can come back and relate everything to Salesforce. So that's one way I personally have got used to, writing those Jest. And again, I'm not a well-versed JavaScript developer or a guru, but that's one way to get to things. Try to do small things, maybe small recipes, what we call here at Salesforce. Like, you try small recipes and then you start expanding and enhance your skills, basically.
That's a great tip. Yeah.
I think probably this will be the last question that I'll take. So this is a question from someone who is saying, what is your recommendation for SSL certificates used in the API integration? For security purpose, it may not be advisable to store them in version control.
That is very true. And I'll have to think about that one. That is very, very true indeed. So you would typically have a vault or some secure other place. It wouldn't be in your Git repo, but you would have a URL to where that can be found, where you'd want different access control. Same as if you were storing passwords, God forbid, within your source control.
Yeah. One more thing I want to just add on to it is, we actually use a lot of things. For example, we already have patterns in place, like, for example, JWT access, right, with Salesforce. Like, we don't store the username and passwords anywhere in the source control, and all we do is to use authentication mechanism like JWT to access it securely. That's one way to do it. The other thing is environment variables. Most of the CI systems actually provide something called environment variables, or for example, in Mac, if you're using a Mac, or they have keychains where you can actually securely store or encrypt and store it. So there are mechanisms like that. So what you do is you typically don't store anything in your source control and just either hide it inside an environment variable, which you cannot access it, as in needed. That means you cannot access it just by looking at that variable. It's all encrypted once you kind of put it into the database. I know, vendors like Circle CI or GitHub Actions actually provide that kind of a capability. So look for something like that, and yeah, never store, secrets inside your Git repository. That's a no. Never do that. Other thing that I have is, it need not be just certs. There are so much of things that can be secured. Like, for example, you might have a custom metadata, where you are actually putting some kind of a key or a password key. Never actually even store that. And one of the concepts, Richard, that I've been exploring was, how can we make metadata dynamic? That is, you don't want to put keys there. Instead, you want to put some kind of a template, and a string template, and that string template maps to an environment variable on the server, and then automatically you have a script which kind of maps back that to the actual environment variables, and before that final action has. So adopt a strategy, something like that.
Yeah, and obviously named credentials is also another fantastic feature that is, I've put things through the App Exchange review, and I had to change them to use named credentials, and I had made the mistake of even storing the right URL endpoint for something, even that was a GUID, for example. I stored it in a custom setting or custom metadata. I moved it to named credentials, problem solved.
Right. Awesome. All right, thank you so much, everyone. We had lots of participation, and this was really a great session.